If you've spent any amount of time playing Overwatch, then I'm sure something like this has happened to you. This is called a de-strafing, and it's where you try to become as difficult to hit as possible with consecutive and slightly random uses of the left, right, and crouch movement keys. It is also the most under-examined mechanic in all of Overwatch, which is why I, a Season 8 top 100 DPS player, spent over 6 hours shooting every single character in the game and graphing my results to unravel the information buried in this mechanic. Let's go over my method. I fired 400 shots as Cassidy towards every hero in the game. Each of these heroes was moving in the most unpredictable way possible by using this aim trainer workshop and customizing the settings accordingly. The reason why I used a workshop and not a real person was because this first test took almost 4 hours, and I didn't want to subject someone else to that torture. I also specifically tried aiming at the enemy's heads to get the 2x damage multiplier and increase the realism a tad, since most of the time you should be aiming at the enemy's heads anyways. Here are the results of the first test. As we can see, it's a bit of a mess, but we can still take some information from this. Firstly, blue means body shot and red means headshot. So for someone like Orisa, we can see that 48% of the shots that I hit were headshots, although I only hit her 71% of the time. Meaning that out of every 100 shots that I took, only 34 were a headshot. Compare that to someone like Ashe, who had a proportionally larger headshot percentage of 63%. You might guess that means I headshot Ashe more than Orisa, but you would be wrong. Ashe's headshot percentage was higher, but I only hit 45% of my total shots on her, meaning that for every 100 shots, only 28.5 of them were headshots. And we can see that difference if we move both of these headshot bars and place them next to each other. Here we can clearly see that I'm hitting more total headshots on Orisa than Ashe. Sojourn players and Kiriko players should pay heavy attention right now, because out of all of the graphs in this video, this graph is the most useful one to know. For Sojourn, since the railgun has a smaller damage multiplier from headshots, they're overall less important to go for, so it's worth looking at the total accuracy stats and using that information to roughly estimate how much damage you will be doing to each hero. For instance, you are going to struggle less against a Genji or Omnic form Marblr compared to other heroes, since you lose less value from a low headshot count, meaning you should be more comfortable just railgunning the body of these two, since you'll probably miss the headshot anyways. Now for Kiriko players, it's the opposite. If you main Kiriko, you should be looking at the total headshot count and using that to gauge how much damage you will be doing due to the insane crit multiplier that she has. Noticing that you'll have a much easier time against Roadhog, Orisa, Ashe, Widowmaker, and Symmetra than you might on any other characters, while you might struggle especially against a Genji or Omnic form Ramatra. I would also say that this graph is important for Ana players for the same reasons as it is for Sojourn players, the lack of necessity for headshots. Although in this test I was still aiming for the head, which you wouldn't do for Ana, and this small aim difference is going to change the total accuracy against each hero, some far more than others, which we might be exploring later in the video, hint hint. Before doing anything else, we need to clean up these stats a little bit. Splitting the accuracy between body shots and headshots is interesting and useful for some, but what if we combine the two into a total accuracy stat? To do this, we can divide the percentage of headshots by the total accuracy, then add that value back to the original accuracy. If we then halve that number, we get a total damage received percentage. The higher the number, the more damage was taken. It's important to know that in this graph, a score of 100 would mean that the hero got hit 100% of the time and each hit was a headshot. Quick pause. 3 months later me talking here, they released a tank passive which makes headshots less valuable against tanks, which means that tanks can't actually reach 100% damage received. Instead, they cap at 87.5%, which sucks for me. And while we're on it, Venture isn't in this video either, so I'm cutting my losses and just trying to finish this video. Thanks for understanding, back to the explanation. And a score of 50 would just mean that every shot landed but was only a body shot. Now that we have our formula, think for a moment and decide what characters you think take the most damage and least damage while AD strafing. 3, 2, 1. The character who takes the most damage is Roadhog, with 57% of total damage taken, and the character with the least is Baby D.Va at 23% of total damage taken. Now let's show everyone else in between. As we can see, we have some pretty interesting results. Roadhog, Reinhardt, Orisa and Winston are the only heroes to take more than 50% of total possible damage. Everyone else, on the other hand, is sitting comfortably below that mark, which is interesting since it seems that it's almost better to consistently hit body shots rather than go for crits and miss. Taking a look at the shape of the graph itself, we find that the first quarter seems to drop off quite steeply until reaching Pharah, a 28% decrease in damage received compared to Roadhog. Then the graph seems to slow down for the middle 50% of heroes, decreasing damage received by another 23% from Pharah until Illari, where it steepens up again, decreasing 27% of damage received from Illari until Baby D.Va. It's worth pointing out that these percentages here are relative percentages to other heroes and aren't the total percentage decreases. What this shows is that most of the hero base is pretty similar in terms of difficulty to damage, with only a few very difficult to damage heroes, and a handful of far easier to damage heroes. Let's take a look at some outliers, such as Ramattra, Zarya, and Junker Queen. They seem to be far harder to damage than the rest of the tank roster. Now, to some of you, Zarya and Junker Queen aren't too surprising, but Ramattra? According to my testing, he is the 10th hardest hero to damage in the game. Very intriguing. On the other hand, we have Torbjorn and Bastion, who are tied 7th as the easiest heroes to hit. Bastion isn't all too surprising since his hitbox size is larger than many tanks. But Torbjorn? He's the shortest hero in the game. How can these two heroes have the same damage mitigation from AD strafing? Also, why is she here? You're telling me that Tracer is easier to hit than Ana? Well, in a real match, definitely not, but in this test, yes, and here's why. In a normal match, Anas spend a significant amount of their time scoped in without the slightest hint of lateral movement, making them easy to hit and take off guard. Tracers, on the other hand, aren't necessarily hard to kill because of their AD strafes, they're hard to kill because of those gosh dang abilities. If used right, these abilities are far more useful to Tracer's survivability than how erratically she can jitter the movement keys, making Tracer, functionally, the hardest enemy to hit in game. With that said, I think it's time to go over the 5 things that influence a character's hit ability in Overwatch 2. The first one is hitbox size. The total size of a hero's hitbox is going to influence how easy they are to hit. Hitbox movement from strafing is another one. Some hitboxes can change position more erratically than others, making them harder to hit. Critical hit position. A crit box located close to the hero's hitbox will increase the chance that even if someone misses the head, they will at least land a body shot and not miss entirely. Hitbox density. Having the mass of the hitbox more centralized makes it easier to hit. And finally, awkward hitbox shape. The amount that a hitbox might be rotated or tilted can make it harder to hit. An example of an awkward hitbox might be someone like Ana, who always seems to tilt towards her right, and whenever she moves, it's more exaggerated on her right than her left. So what character has a large hitbox, low movement from strafing, a centered crit position, a high hitbox density, and a normal hitbox shape? D.Va. Some of the keen-eyed among you might have noticed that I didn't test D.Va. Why is that? It's because I can't test D.Va in my custom game. Because once you demech D.Va, you have to shoot at Baby D.Va, which changes the accuracy statistics. And worse, she doesn't even respawn with the mech once you kill her. There are ways to remedy this, such as giving her infinite health, but since the AI always wants to get close, D.Va ends up just running around in your face, and even if she didn't do that, having her not respawn ever would increase my accuracy and add a factor that none of the other heroes had, making the tests inconsistent. So for this test, we are going to leave D.Va out of the equation. Now, back to Torbjorn. Knowing these 5 factors gives us an idea on why Torbjorn was so easy to hit, because while his hitbox may be kinda small, it's very dense, and his head is located right in the center of it. Not only that, but when he strafes, his hitbox moves predictably, and his hitbox isn't awkward at all. Ramattra, on the other hand, has a large hitbox but a very low hitbox density, with it spread out over a large area. His head is located away from the rest of his body, and he moves like a featherweight boxer while AD strafing. This makes him quite hard to hit when you're aiming for his head. So now that we've gone through all the heroes' AD strafes and how much damage they mitigate, let's use that to determine a total survivability rating. This rating will give us an idea of how long it will take to eliminate an enemy based on their total health and the damage they mitigate from AD strafing. So for instance, Soldier 76 has 250 health and he got a damage received score of 35%. If we divide 100 by 35, we get a value of 2.85, meaning that Soldier takes 2.85 less damage while AD strafing than he would if he wasn't moving at all. So if we multiply his 250 health by 2.85, then we get a total survivability rating of 715. If we then halve this value, we get a barrier health equivalent of 355, rounded to the nearest 5, meaning that, on average, it takes the same time to break a 355 health barrier as it does to eliminate an AD strafing soldier. For heroes that have armor or a passive that grants damage reduction, I've factored those into the barrier health equivalent calculations, although this was all done when armor had a global 30% damage reduction. It was recently changed to reducing a flat 5 damage per instance of damage, a change that makes armor's damage reduction subjective to the hero who is attacking it. So to compromise, everything has been calculated using a flat 30% damage reduction from armor, which I think is still a nice compromise. If we do that for each hero, we get everyone's respective barrier health equivalent, or BHE for short. Something to keep in mind with this statistic is that it can actually be smaller than the hero's original health due to the fact that you can't get crit multipliers on barriers. This bottoms out at half the hero's health if you were to never miss a headshot, whereas if you were to never miss a body shot, you would get the same value as the enemy's health. Time to crunch some numbers. Here's the finished graph, and we can see definitively how hard each hero is to kill when they are AD strafing. Marblr leads the way, followed closely by Marblr in difficulty to kill, which is surprising given this is Marblr we're talking about without his abilities. So what's the deal? Marblr for one is actually really quite fast when he isn't shooting. His head hitbox is placed away from the rest of his hitbox and he has a massive health pool. All of these factors give him a really high time to kill. Now looking at the shape of the graph, we see a large drop off over the tank roster, smoothed out by a couple squishy outliers with Kiriko having the highest BHE out of all the non-tanks, before the graph mostly plateaus for the rest of the support and damage characters. Some of these results aren't satisfying, and I think it might be due to the fact that during this whole test I've been aiming solely for the enemy's heads. But now that we've gone through what impacts a character's hit ability, we can make some aim adjustments to maximize our damage output, and hopefully give some advice to increase the amount of shots you hit, simply by changing where you aim. Take Sojin for example. While she is strafing, her head and torso moves a large distance, making it difficult to hit. Another thing that we see is that her head hitbox is placed away from the rest of her body, meaning that if we miss her head, we also miss the rest of her body. So with that in mind, should we be aiming somewhere else? Let's take a look at Sojin's legs. Notice how her legs don't move very much in comparison to her head. If we could consistently hit her legs, that would most likely outweigh the detriment of not landing the crit multiplier from the headshot. So let's mark Sojin as a retest candidate, this time aiming at her center mass. We can also mark a dozen or so other heroes that might benefit from a retest. The heroes that I've marked for retest include Baby D.Va, Junker Queen, Marblr, Ramattra, Sigma, Zarya, Reaper, Sojin, Sombra, Symmetra, Tracer, Ana, Kiriko, and Zenyatta, since these are the heroes that had the most difficult movement patterns, causing me to miss an unreasonable amount of shots. This time in testing, I aimed either at the center mass of the target or wherever they move the least while jiggling. Since these will be problem characters in your games, let's go through how I adjusted my aim on each one. For Baby D.Va, her head moves a bunch whenever she moves left to right or whenever she crouches, whereas her thigh area moves comparatively little and has a larger hitbox area. So this time, aiming at her thighs, we get 64% weapon accuracy with 2% crit accuracy. This gives her a damage received score of 32.5% and a reduced barrier health equivalent of 270. For Junker Queen, it's a different story. This time aiming at her chest/upper chest to get the stray headshot whenever she crouches, while also consistently landing body shots. For Marblr, I aimed at his upper chest as well, since this is the widest part of his hitbox, and also allows for a stray headshot here and there. Aiming at Ramattra's torso seemed to be the best move because his legs move quite unpredictably, and his crouch drops his head far enough that you might just shoot over him if you aimed much higher. Aiming at Sigma's chest also seemed best as it's by far the widest part of his hitbox. For Zarya, her torso and legs seemed about the same in terms of damage. Her legs are slightly wider and move less, but aiming at her torso sometimes gets the opportunity to headshot her when she crouches, so it's a 50-50 with her. Aiming at Reaper's torso was most effective as it doesn't shift around much during his AD strafe. For Sojourn, her strength is also her weakness, since her cybernetic legs are quite a lot wider than the rest of her hitbox and also move around far less while AD strafing. Sombra's a similar story as her thighs lag behind the rest of her movement when she's AD strafing, making them easiest to hit. Aiming at Symmetra's legs/thighs increased my damage output for the same reason. Her hitbox is wider there and moves less. Aiming at Tracer's thighs was also most effective for the same reasons. Ana's hips don't move as much as the rest of her body due to her scoliosis posture, making it the easiest part to damage. Same old for Kiriko, as her legs move the least and have the widest hitbox. And finally, aiming at Zenyatta's legs netted a large increase in shots landed. This is because he doesn't do anything but hover left to right, and his crossed legs provide a super wide hitbox to land shots on. Let's now take a look at how all these aim changes shifted the stats of these heroes. You might be asking why I didn't retest all the heroes, and that's because for most heroes, aiming for the lower part of their head is the best place to shoot, which is what I did for the first test. Something interesting to note is just how much we changed the accuracy of some of these heroes. Ramantra went from the 10th to the 24th hardest hero to damage in the game, moving up 14 positions just from aiming a little lower. It's also worth noting how much flatter the damage received graph is, moving all those really hard to damage heroes much higher up. In terms of BHE, some heroes such as Sombra, Symmetra and Tracer barely budged, whereas Kiriko, Ramantra, Sigma and Zen moved by more than 100. Kiriko alone dropped from 530 BHE down to 410, which is still hard to kill for a squishy, but it's 22.5% quicker than before, all just from shooting her legs. Armed with our new knowledge on where to aim, let's retest every hero, but this time using all their abilities. Then we can graph, analyze, and make conclusions about the survivability of every hero. In this test, I've made it so that each hero being tested never dies, so I can keep a realistic fighting distance throughout. This means that I can actually test D.Va. I also added 4 more data points: Bastion's Sentry form, Ramantra's Nemesis form, Winston's Primal Rage, and a fully scoped in Ana. The reason for these extra data points is because they noticeably change the hitboxes or behavior of these heroes, and that difference is important to showcase. Now we see that D.Va unsurprisingly takes the lead with 99% total accuracy, followed up closely by Sentry Bastion, who I only missed once every 20 shots. Overall, we see a large increase in total accuracy compared to the previous test. Why is that? We would expect enemies to be harder to hit if they're allowed to use abilities, right? It depends. For some heroes, this is obviously the case, such as Tracer, who is definitely harder to hit when she's allowed to blink and recall. But Doomfist? Not so much. He is much higher up on this graph than I expected, and no, I was not shooting his block. Instead, Doomfist just gets caught in his punch charging animation, and he follows a predictable trajectory when he uses Slam, both making him easier to land shots on. Although, this doesn't explain the overall increase in accuracy across the graph. That would instead be due to the closer ranged encounters and the non-respawning enemies, 2 factors that are going to lead to these stats being far more accurate when extrapolated to real matches. If we take a look to the bottom of the graph, we see Illari with the lowest total accuracy. In fact, I miss a little more than half of my shots on her, although when I do land a shot, it's most likely to be a headshot. How much of this is due to her being relatively newer and me being less experienced with her movement is something to be considered, although realistically it's not going to be much. Taking a look back at Widowmaker and Ashe, we see some crazy high headshot percentages, with 73% headshot percentage on Ashe and 68% on Widowmaker. It's entirely their fault for scoping in and making themselves easier to hit, but that's to be expected in a real match, isn't it? One last thing that I'd like to point out is that out of the 200 shots that I fired at each hero, I landed the exact same many headshots and body shots on both Zarya and Sojourn. That doesn't mean anything, but it's kinda cool nonetheless. Moving our attention over to the damage received graph, we can confirm that Tracer is the hardest character to damage in-game. This is because of her strong AD strafe, small hitbox, and fast mobility. Although you didn't need me to say that, did you? Both Winston and Winston with Primal Rage take the same amount of damage, which is a little surprising because when Winston uses Primal Rage, his hitbox increases drastically in size. But this change in size was perfectly countered by the fact that I was being ape-smacked through the air, which reduced my accuracy accordingly. Bastion with Sentry form takes less damage than a Recon form Bastion, as long as you are in front of him, because when he transforms, his crit box shifts behind him. And I didn't test this, but I suspect that shooting a Sentry Bastion from behind nets similar numbers to someone like Roadhog. Bastion is also the easiest squishy to damage, unless you don't count him as a squishy, because then it would be Torbjorn. Unless you also don't count him, then it would be Ashe, who is definitely a squishy. And on the other end, Zarya is the hardest tank to damage. Unless you count Baby Diva as a tank, because despite having the lowest health in the game, she does still have the tank passive. Now I've given each hero a barrier health equivalent just like last time. You take how much damage a hero mitigates and multiply that by the health and armor to get a barrier health equivalent. But that's not cool here because we're trying to be realistic. We need to factor in abilities and how much those play a role in survivability. And just like before, I'm going to ask you to take a guess as to which hero has the highest barrier health equivalent, including abilities. Let's see, in 3, 2, 1. Ramattra has the highest barrier health equivalent and second most complicated process out of all the heroes, and it's all down to his block. You see, if Ramattra goes into Nemesis form and holds down block, then he will take you just as long to kill as a 3410 health barrier, which is already very high, but it doesn't end there, because there is a specific sequence of actions that you can take to maximize the armor gained from entering Nemesis form and micromanaging your shield placement. First, you place down his shield, then you enter Nemesis form and hold down your block. Entering Nemesis form gives you 225 extra armor, and block reduces all damage from the front by 75%. This stacks alongside the 30% damage reduction from armor, giving you 82.5% total damage reduction in this state. If you then use your ultimate, you will gain another 225 armor, further pushing up your barrier health equivalent. If your ultimate then lasts more than 7 seconds, you will have refreshed your Nemesis form cooldown and your shield, allowing you to reshield and re-enter Nemesis form to gain another 225 armor while blocking the entire time. It's worth noting that you only gain the extra armor to a max of 225 above Ramattra's original health pool, meaning you can't use Nemesis form and his ultimate in quick succession to gain 550 armor. You would have to lose the extra 225 armor and then gain the maximum 225 armor from his ultimate. If done correctly, this amounts to anywhere between 21 and 34 seconds of constant 82.5% damage reduction and a total health pool of 1200, all working out to a total barrier health equivalent of 7730, assuming Ramattra never lost all his armor damage reduction bonus but lost at least 225 armor between transformations. Who could possibly top this ridiculous sequence of protection, other than Echo, who can just do the exact same thing while also having her own health pool on top, managing to secure a respectable second place? Some of you might be wondering why Symmetra is so high up, and that's because of her ultimate. Photon Barrier has 4000 HP, and that accounts for almost all of her BHE, since in the best scenario you would have to break her entire barrier before killing her. I decided against including smart things like walking past barriers into the calculations, since that's impossible to quantify. For some characters, it's also possible to have an infinite BHE because they gain health from an ability or an ultimate, and they can technically build it back up before they die. For instance, a Winston using Primal Rage can knock a bunch of people off a ledge right before his ultimate finishes, and when they die, he will get all that juicy ult charge, letting him use his ult again and gaining any missing health. The same is also similar for Ramattra to a lesser extent, and technically if the DPS is really low, basically any character with self-heal has an infinite BHE. Basically, what I'm saying is that this particular graph is mostly for fun and doesn't mean much. Although, I think we should go back and dig into the process that would be required for Echo to take in order to reach such a high BHE, because it is by far the most interesting and time-consuming thing that I've had to calculate in this entire video. Let's jump into it. Echo first has to lose as much health as possible before using her copy on Ramattra. Then she needs to instantly use Shield, then Nemesis form and fire 2 piercing blasts, hitting at least 4 enemies each so she can build her ultimate without being damaged. Then she needs to instantly begin blocking until she loses 225 armor. This process can take 1.5 seconds minimum if everything is done correctly. From here, it's the same as normal Ramattra. Wait for Nemesis form to end, use ultimate. Wait for ultimate to end, use shield, use Nemesis form. With one small difference. Echo needs to intentionally lose her ultimate in around 7 to 13 seconds to give enough time for her Nemesis form to come off cooldown without running out of her 15 seconds of duplicated time. Once her ultimate ends, she should only have a few seconds remaining to use Nemesis form before reverting back to Echo with hopefully mostly full health remaining. Calculating the BHE for this Echo sequence is rather difficult due to the constantly changing values. It starts off easy as we can just add in the 2 barriers used to our total BHE. Each barrier has 1000 health, so that's already 2000 BHE. Next we can add the BHE of Echo, pre and post duplicate. That's 296 BHE before copy and 185 after, bringing our total to 2481. Next is the hard part. We need to calculate the BHE of duplicate. To do this, we need to get the total health value of copied Ramattra, which is his armor multiplied by its damage reduction added to his lowered health pool. Then we apply the damage reduction from block whilst accounting for the time locked out from blocking, such as when casting block or when Nemesis form needs to shoot in order to build Annihilation. Now's also a good time to apply the damage mitigated from AD strafing, ensuring that we separate the mitigation of base Ramattra, Nemesis form Ramattra and blocking Ramattra, due to them having different hitboxes. Once we've done that, we can add in the invincibility applied while casting duplicate, which gives us a final BHE of 7440. Now, adding in the invincibility from casting duplicate isn't a pretty process. In fact, any invincibility or damage reduction has trouble being converted into a barrier health equivalent, because it will block more damage and thus have a higher BHE the more damage is being received. So what I ended up doing was multiplying the damage reduction by its uptime percentage and treating it as a flat damage reduction. In Echo's case, she has 2.24 seconds of 100% damage reduction while entering and exiting her copy. This is divided by the 17.24 second long copy duration, which gives us a flat 13% damage reduction. This isn't a perfect approach because, like, what do I do with Zenyatta? His ultimate gives him 6 seconds of immortality, but there is no way to quantify an uptime, so I can't give him a damage reduction percentage. His value on this graph assumes that he has gained health from using Transcendence, but it doesn't actually account for the immortality during Transcendence whatsoever. In reality, his real BHE is much higher. I also had a similar but worse problem with healing over time effects, since they cause the BHE to increase the longer the heroes stay alive, which is really hard to calculate since I'm not assuming any specific damage per second value and thus no specific time to kill. In the end, I just gave a few seconds of healing over time based roughly on their BHEs regardless. So why don't we do that? Why don't we set a specific damage per second value and create a time to kill graph, which is slightly different from a BHE measurement since it assumes a flat max damage per second of 600. This can be seen as 2 soldiers worth of hard focus. Now all that I have to do is divide the damage received of each hero by the max damage per second of 600, then multiply that by the max health, after accounting for the damage reductions, self-heals, barriers, and invulnerability. Then that gives us each hero's time to kill. Here are those results. we can actually separate how much each ability contributed to the overall time to kill for each hero. And once we do, we can get a rough idea of how these heroes would fare against differing DPS values. Due to the fact that invulnerability is a fixed value, it becomes more valuable at higher DPS numbers than lower ones. Because if we had 10 times the DPS, someone like Marblr, who doesn't have any invulnerability, would drop below 2 seconds. Whereas Zenyatta, who has invulnerability, can't drop below 6 seconds because that's the length of his ultimate. Echo might still win out at these crazy high DPS values because she has 2.24 seconds of invulnerability while duplicating. Now you might think that means she can just copy Zen and use Trans, but that would necessitate building the Transcendence, and that just won't be possible at the high DPS values. Instead, she has to copy Mei and use her Ice Block instantly. This will give her 5 seconds of Ice Block invincibility on top of her 2.24 seconds of duplicate. But this depends on if she gets enough time to use Ice Block, because there is still a small window of time available between Echo's invincibility and when she gains control of her character. Now since this is just a fun graph, there isn't much to analyze, so I'm going to quickly zoom in and pan through to give you a nice perspective of how much each ability contributes to the time to kill. All abilities are assumed in the best case scenario, which is why some abilities like Mei Ice Wall or Wrecking Ball's Overhealth have surprisingly high values, because in this case Wrecking Ball is gaining Overhealth from 5 enemies and a Bob, and Mei Ice Wall is assumed to be fully broken before she can be damaged. There isn't a lot to be learned from these stats that aren't immediately obvious upon playing the game. Maybe you learned where to aim on some tricky heroes, or you learned about the widest parts of some characters' hitboxes. Maybe you were surprised by how easy it is to headshot some heroes like Ashe or Widowmaker, or maybe you learned that this is an unexplored avenue to balance that is repeatedly overlooked by the team when deciding the annoyances of some heroes. Regardless, these are just minor points that might only nudge the needle of your gameplay. And while I'm on the vein of discrediting my entire video, it's worth pointing out that there are a bunch of different characters with completely different aim styles. Soldier aims differently from Cassidy, who aims differently from Symmetra, who aims different from Winston, who aims different from Moira, who aims different from Junkrat. These accuracy stats are barely applicable to most of the characters unless it's directly hit scan. So keep that in mind. Maybe that should have gone at the start. I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed making it, and maybe keep an eye out for some more of my content if you enjoyed this. If you would like me to look into any other mechanic, then feel free to leave a comment down below.